spring of 1958, the rector of St. Chrysostom's left to accept another call. And in those days, it was the vestry. There was not an official search committee process for the search. For many years at St. Chrysostom's, our relationship with the diocese had been very bad. We were and have always been quite low church. And the bishop of the diocese, Bishop Conkling, in the 40s and early 50s, was very high church and put pressure on congregations to conform to his style of worship. I think this was more common then than it was now, that a bishop would, whatever his feelings were, would pressure the congregation to go along with him, and it wasn't, low church bishops did the same. And he stepped down in 1953, and his successor, Bishop Burrell, was much more ready to have congregations follow their prescribed style of worship, and tried as much as he could to improve relationships with the congregation. And I'm sorry to say that St. Chrysostom's remained suspicious and did not take up this opportunity. However, in 1958, when the vestry were looking for a new rector, they did consult Bishop Burrell about it. And the choice they made was the Reverend Robert Bruce Hall, who was from West Virginia. He had lived there all his life, except when he was in college, seminary, and the Army. He was born in Wheeling, West Virginia, and had been at a parish in Huntington, West Virginia. And he had graduated from Trinity College in 1943, served in the Army for 3 years in World War II, and then went to seminary. When he came to St. Chrysostom's, he was married, and he and his wife had 4 children, the oldest of whom was 8. And in general, feelings in the congregation, perhaps the churchmanship issue affected this, but there was a general, somewhat pessimistic outlook. And when Hall came at the very first service, you could tell things were going to be different. He introduced himself to the congregation, and the first thing he said was, "I am an optimist." And it was obvious that he enjoyed taking part in the service. He would sing the hymns very vigorously. He had one favorite hymn, which was "Come Labor On." And the reason that was his favorite was that when he was ordained to the priesthood, instead, he couldn't be ordained with at the regular diocesan ordination service because his wife was 8 months pregnant, and they were afraid that she would be having the baby at the time of the service. So they put the ordination up for a month, and at the end of the service, this hymn was sung, and Hall and the bishop looked and saw his wife, 8 months pregnant, sitting in the congregation, and they could hardly keep a straight face because of her condition. And I can also remember that the lesson once was the passage from, I think it's Ezekiel, about the dry bones, like the spiritual. And this was before you had lay people reading the lessons. And he was up there reading, and you could tell he was just thinking about the spiritual and was having the greatest time reading it. immediately, relationships with the diocese improved. Bishop Burrell came to officiate at his institution, and then some years later, when Bishop Montgomery was elected suffragan bishop, he was living in the area right near the church, and he would come every Wednesday morning when his schedule permitted to the St. Chrysostom's early Eucharist. We had not seen any changes in churchmanship when Bob Hall came. He continued the Low Church traditions, but not too long after he came, he received a letter from the rector of the Church of the Ascension asking if he would be guest preacher at a evening high mass at Ascension. I believe it was Epiphany. And Bob Hall got on the phone immediately and called to say yes, he would be delighted to attend. And this brief silence at the end of the phone, and then the rector said, well, if I had known you would accept, I would have called you, but he said I was so sure that you would turn me down and that it would be so embarrassing for you to come up with a good excuse on the phone, I thought I would write you. And Hall did indeed go to the service and preach, and he came back and he told the congregation that this was not his style of worship, and he wasn't going to introduce it at St. Chrysostom's, but it was what they liked at Ascension, and he saw no reason why the two churches, in spite of differences in churchmanship, could not work together. And Hall was very popular as a preacher. Sermons in the previous rector had been good but quite intellectual, and these were more informal, and the congregation really liked this. And Hall had considered at one time that he might want to be a teacher, and his sermons were explaining issues of religious belief were particularly well received. And in addition to being more informal in his sermons, he was the first rector of the congregation openly to encourage everyone to refer to him by his first name. In past rectors, many people had done this, but it was not openly encouraged as Bob Hall and later rectors had done. Hall had come from a parish where he had succeeded a man who had been rector for 40 years, and this left him very ready to introduce new programs and to make changes. There were more study groups added to the activity list. A young adult group, they'd had them in the past, but this had kind of, the members had aged and they had not had a new replacement group. And there were Lent programs, one of which was a play reading group. They had a book of religious plays, and there was a woman in the congregation who was interested in leading this, and I went to many sessions of that, and it was very pleasant and attracted people from wide age range and groups in the parish. And less successful were attempts to set up a program for teenagers in the parish, and the idea of a senior citizen group fell completely flat because apparently nobody wanted to consider themselves as senior citizens. The women at that time, the major activities of the group focused around the annual bazaar and rummage sale. And Bob Hall wanted to get a different focus and to bring more spiritual emphasis to the group. And he started a women's Bible study that met an hour before the actual group meeting began. And the bazaar, for many years, had run for 2 days, and there was a big turkey dinner on the second night. And gradually, during his tenure, the cut back on the time, and it was only 1 day, and instead of having a big bazaar turkey dinner, they had a big dinner at the time of the Every Member Canvass. There were some less positive changes that he made. The parish had had a long time community center program, after-school activities for not parish but neighborhood children, and this had gone on for many years. And Bob Hall, soon after he came, decided to discontinue it, hoping to replace it with a teenage program for the congregation, and that did not work out. I will say, however, that probably the community center would have ended soon after in any case, because shortly after Hall came was the urban renewal project that ended up with the construction of Sandburg Village, and the area North Division, Clark, LaSalle, that where the Sandburg Village stands now, the land was cleared, and the people living in it had been small, kind of rundown apartments and small stores on Clark Street with maybe apartments over them. And the attendance at the community center mainly came from this area, and so there probably wouldn't have been many people left to come to attend. But I personally think it's too bad that this major outreach program ended and we didn't look for something else that could replace it in some way with serving a different group of people or a different type of program. What was very important in parish activities in the early 60s was consideration of how we could reach out to the new people moving into Sandburg Village. There was a Lenten program in 1963 which got regularly about 60 people at the sessions, and much discussion about how this would be could be done, and very and ended up we had more than once a year we'd have inquirers classes and confirmation classes, and if when the confirmation class was completed, instead of having the people wait until the bishop made his next visitation, they would come to be encouraged to be confirmed at the monthly confirmation at the cathedral. And we had had coffee hours before that time, but great emphasis now is placed on welcoming visitors. And this did not always work out as one might expect. I remember being in a coffee hour and a woman whose husband had recently been elected to the vestry partly because he was a very outgoing, warm kind of person and would be good with newcomers. She came up to me and she saw a man sitting by himself and she said, "Is that a stranger, do you know?" And I looked at him and I said, "Oh no, he's been coming here for many years." And she said, "Oh good, then I don't have to go and talk to him." And there was another man who attended some of these meetings, and he was very much on the old school and not the best way. And when talking about welcoming people, he said, well, he didn't think we should be so willing to welcome just everybody. One big good thing that took place in the years when Bob Hall was at St. Chrysostom's. These were the baby boom years. Halls had 4 children when they came to St. Chrysostom's, and the National Church was making a big effort to improve the church school curriculums. And we had done a little bit of this before Hall came, but he really focused on this. And he got a couple. The man was on the faculty at Seabury Western teaching Christian education, and his wife was taught Christian education at Garrett Seminary, and he got them to take charge of the Sunday school and introduce the new curriculum. And one part of this program for the kindergarten was that there was a storybook on baptism. It was called How Susan Got Her Name. And the Halls had a 5th child while they were at St. Chrysostom's, and her name was Susan. And so for the first time, I think, in the history of the parish, they arranged that Susan was going to be baptized at the 11 o'clock service, and all the children from the kindergarten were able to come, and they crowded around the font, watched while Susan was baptized, just like the little story about how Susan got her name. And the teachers, there were regular meetings with the group, and they started a library for the Sunday school and the church, and I was in charge of that, and as the librarian I got invited to these monthly dinner and program meetings. And there was one I remember that was very well received, and Hall was answering questions that people had about how you talk to children about the faith, and what do you do when your dog dies? And he laughed, and he said, well, yes, you could say the dog went to dog heaven, but he said, this is not theologically, what you'd for the first time since probably the Depression, they did a full-scale every member canvass in 1962, and got just lots of people from the congregation. They had several team leaders, and all of them got teams with 3 or 4 people on them, and we went around and called on people at their homes or would meet with them after church, and the response was really excellent, and it really did make people feel they were more a part of the congregation. A tie-in with this that is, I did not realize until I started doing research on the church. Just as the campaign was starting in the fall of 1962 was the time when African-American James Meredith was seeking admission to the University of Mississippi, and was not being allowed to enter, and there was a great deal of controversy. And on a Sunday when Hall was away, his assistant was the preacher, and he preached a sermon strongly defending the admission of Meredith to the university. And I was very pleased by this, and I heard no comments, either pro or con, about the sermon, but at least one member of the vestry spoke to Hall later, and I saw this in the vestry minutes, and it is expressing concern about the assistant's recent sermon, and I had no idea what this was, and I keep a journal, and I went through that journal, and I realized that this was what it was all about. They wanted Hall to perhaps consider screening the sermon topics, and I hope that the opposition was more because they were afraid that somebody in the congregation might want to not give at the every member canvass than because they really disapproved of admitting Meredith to the university. And there's no record that Bob Hall did anything to stop his assistant from preaching on these topics, and it didn't cause wide concern among the congregation. At the time that Hall came to St. Chrysostom's, they didn't have a rotating vestry, and one of the things that he had specified on accepting the call was that he was to be allowed to introduce a rotating vestry. He didn't realize that there was a man in the congregation who had served on the vestry for nearly 50 years, and he was a little bit concerned about that, but they paid a special tribute to him on his 50th anniversary, and he was not there at the time because of ill health, and actually died a couple of weeks later. But they read into the minutes of the annual meeting that the great faithful service that this man had given all these years, and the vestry drew lots to see whether they would stay on for 1, 2, 3, or 4 more years. And then in 1961, the first vestry with 4-year terms were elected. And at the time, they also introduced a retirement age for people on the parish staff of 72. And Harold Simons, who had been our organist since 1924, actually, was about to become 72, and so this was going to be his end of his service, and he retired in June. And his successor was a man named Robert Lodeen, and he introduced a lot of work music that was new to the congregation. Simons, in his last years, had stuck kind of to a standard repertoire, and Lodeen introduced some newer pieces that were, I think, generally well received. And his dog was named Vivaldi, and he became quite a fixture in the parish, and would often go stay in the church when Bob was practicing. And Bob was going to give an organ recital at St. Chrysostom's, and a woman in the congregation spoke to him and said that she had a friend who was blind and used a seeing eye dog, and she thought that the friend would very much enjoy hearing the concert if it would be okay to bring the dog. And Bob replied and said, "Oh yes, tell your friend to bring her dog, and I will bring Valdi so the dog can have company." And I wish I knew whether this had actually happened, but it's a great story. There was a capital campaign that had been planned before Hall came, that went on in the 1959, and the three major things that came out of that campaign was that the Sunday school rooms were enlarged and improved considerably. An elevator, the first elevator connecting the various levels of the church and parish house, was installed, and air conditioning was put in the church in conjunction with that. On actually March 1st, 1966, there was a small fire in the parish. The Harding Room suffered smoke damage. The church did not suffer any damage, but the Harding Room could not be used for several months, and they had to clear the vestments out of the sacristy and do some washing and cleaning. And this was almost certainly caused by a cigarette butt that had not been extinguished at an AA meeting in the parish, but they kept this quiet and came up with some other cause, because there were people in the congregation who didn't approve of the church hosting 12-step groups, and would have taken this as a reason to cancel the programs at church. Then in May, it was announced that Hall was one of the candidates for the forthcoming election of Bishop Coadjutor of Virginia. And the election took place on the 23rd, and he was elected. And the consecration was scheduled for October 21st, Friday. And he encouraged as many people from the congregation as possible to come to Richmond to attend the service. And at that time, there was only one direct flight from Chicago to Richmond a day, and I was one of the people that went down, and nearly the entire plane was filled with people going to that service. And I came into the waiting room, and there was this big laugh was coming up from a bunch of clergy, and Bishop Montgomery came over and greeted me, and he said, "We're just speculating what would happen if the plane goes down, because the bishop, the suffragan bishop, the retired suffragan bishop, the archdeacon, and the dean of the cathedral were all on the same plane." And fortunately, everything went smoothly. Most of the people who came down planned to stay, spent the weekend somewhere in the east, as I did. But Robert Lodeen had wanted to come down, and he was, in addition to being organist at St. Chrysostom's, he was the music director at a synagogue, and they, of course, had a Friday night service. So he had to be back for that. And he was going to stay overnight on the Thursday and come back on an early afternoon flight on the next day. And so he just took a briefcase with a change of a shirt and underwear and socks. And because at that time you couldn't buy liquor by the drink in Virginia, he put in a thermos containing 2 Manhattans. He checked his suitcase instead of carrying it with him on the plane, and this proved to be a big mistake, because he got to his room in Richmond and he opened it up and the thermos had broken. And his took out all the clothes, and they smelled of alcohol, and he hung them up and hoped by the next morning they would smell better, but they didn't. And so he wore the same shirt and socks and everything that he had worn down there, because he said he didn't want the people of Virginia to think that their new bishop had hired an alcoholic organist. Many of the Chicago clergy took part in the service, but the preacher was Bishop Campbell, of West Virginia, who had been Bob Hall's bishop before he came to Chicago. And he made comments about West Virginia and East Virginia, and he said, now Virginia has revenge for losing the Civil War. He came many years later as a guest preacher at St. Chrysostom's, and I said something about I remembered his sermon at the consecration, and he laughed and he said, "Oh, I never lived that down."